Hello, everybody. We are back to talk about sequels today. We got a full house, as you can see, or almost full house. And most everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with a standard sequel, a true sequel, if you were, that's just continuing the events in a relatively standard fashion. Something perhaps like Lord of the Rings or Wheel of Time, which is very long. But what we want to talk about today are more cinematic universe sequels, which we're seeing a lot happen, of course, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You can see happen with Brandon's Cosmere. And then we also want to talk about sequels where the nature of the story really changes and the impact that that can have on reader expectation. So first thing up, we're going to go big and talk about the nature of these expanded universes where there's a lot of threads that are going out there. Obviously, we've recently had two sequels in the Marvel Universe side of things, with Doctor Strange and Thor. And the receptions of those, of course, perhaps I shouldn't say of course, but if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, they are a bit mixed. And surprising to me that Doctor Strange is actually doing better than Thor. We could talk about the fallacies of those signs, perhaps, but I will just toss that up to the group for now and add in my thoughts after we've heard some responses just to this opening. What do y'all think about those sequels and universes?
If I may, this is a little off topic and a little different than what I said I was going to say, but I do like the example that you gave of Lord of the Rings as a sequel, but I think also it should be considered a series sequel, right? Because it is a sequel to The Hobbit. And I think in that sense, it highlights the strengths of a potential series sequel, in that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, while they inhabit the same world, are certainly very different types of stories, right? With The Lord of the Rings maybe maturing a little bit, maybe taking itself, some might argue, a little bit more seriously. We can debate whether or not Tolkien himself would agree with that, but that could be an argument that's stated. I think that's kind of the potential behind series sequels, right? Is you take an existing world, you take existing stories and have the opportunity to approach them in new and different ways. And if you've already done so a number of different times, like in the case of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right, where we have dozens and dozens of story entries, if people are still sticking with you at this point, it gives you the opportunity to experiment, because you have a great degree of kind of like reader loyalty, fan base loyalty, for better or worse, right? Like even with Thor the Dark, sorry, not the Dark World, geez. Even with, though I'd say that's a pretty good idea, a pretty good example of what I'm about to say as well. Even with Thor and Doctor Strange recently not doing as well, you see a fair amount of Marvel fans in the online discourse kind of saying, hey, these movies aren't that deep, shut up and enjoy them, is kind of the rhetoric that like a lot of people have given, which I would say is not like a great rhetoric to approach your media with personally, but it does drive home the point that there is a fan base that's basically going to continue to consume these movies regardless of what they do, and how good they are, right? Which then that loyalty kind of gives Marvel an opportunity, depending on who you are, how you stand on it, to experiment and try new things, as I think they have done pretty frequently with their TV shows of late, or potentially even just Marvel can kind of suck, and the fans that they expect to be loyal to them will continue to be loyal to them.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, am I going?
Oh, yes.
Okay, there's no going back. I don't know, turning the Marvel, I'm going to refer to as the Marvel metaphor to book series. Marvel's treatment of their universe in the MCU reminds me quite a bit of book series that were really popular when I was younger, where it would be about a series of people, but a different author would take different books. So you may meet Beth in the first book, but then Beth has her own book and eventually in the series, but another author writes it. And it's kind of what these series do is they take a lot of risks because they bring in all of these very good authors who do bring their own independent styles. And so you may like book 2, but you might hate book 4 or book 5. And I think there's pros and cons to that. Not talking about the author perspective, but just talking about the expansive world building, I feel like Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows is a really good example of where this can be successful. Because if you like traditional, like mid or traditional, like early 2010 YA fantasy, Shadow and Bone is perfect for you. It fits the formula. If you want something darker and a bit more risky, you can turn to Six of Crows, and they function independently. So it's an expanding universe, but it's one where you can enter and leave at any point, which I think is quite successful for those series.
So how do you keep fan loyalty as you keep expanding the universe and expanding into more sequels? What do you guys think? How do you retain that loyalty if you're going to change the author or creator? How do you retain that loyalty if you're going to spin off into new POV characters? For how long are you going to keep coming back for more when what you're getting isn't what you came here for in the first place?
I think there needs to be a specific draw that is a through line for the entire cinematic universe, and or just in the case of conjoined universes, I think the real draw of, say, Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, for example, is the fact that it's all written by him. Like, whereas the MCU, you have multiple different directors and producers making each of the movies. In this one, we know that it might be on a different world with entirely different characters, but it's still Brandon writing it. And so there is a certain level of trust that we have in the way he writes, to the point that he can say, okay, this is not the book you should read first. This is the one you should read once you trust me, because it's in the same universe, but it's also wildly different. So you can get those varying different books in page length and story arc, all that, if you have one single great visionary who can kind of lead the whole thing. That's at least how I imagined is one of the easiest way to do it.
I agree, especially, and I think the answer to how much reader drop off are you going to experience is going to depend on where you are in terms of delivering as a creator, right? Brandon Sanderson can get away with a lot at this point because he's got 20 years worth of delivering solid, enjoyable novels nearly every single time, right? And likewise for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like they were able to take some additional risks because, I mean, especially in the beginning, they delivered like half a dozen or more movies that were anywhere from decent to fantastic, and linked them together in a way that nobody had ever really seen on screen before. And so that earned them a lot of buy-in, to the point where they're still really writing on it, and can A, swing for the fences and do some weird stuff that they couldn't have done before, but B, put out the occasional stinker and still have people come back. I, on the other hand, with one book in the Amazon catalog at the moment, can't get away with that. I'm really sad about it.
No, I think it's a great question that Eric asked, because mainly, you know, we're writers. We're recording this mainly for writers, and it's a wonderful thing to think of if you are someone that does want to have an expanded universe, or even if you just want to be writing in different genres. How can you get someone that's reading your one type of book, maybe romance or sci-fi or whatever it is, to then read something else? And sometimes you can't. Like sometimes readers just aren't interested in jumping from one category to another. But I think Marvel is a really good example, and Brandon Sanderson, of they've really tried some different genres, especially with their TV shows, and they're still keeping a lot of people going. And I think a promise that the Marvel movies are able to have, unlike the promise of, say, a singular creator like Brandon Sanderson, which I do agree is a strong strength, is that there was always a levity to Marvel movies. There was always some humor to Marvel movies. They didn't fall into that like deep dark and sadness for the most part that we saw with like DC, for instance. And so I think that there was a certain, I'm not going to go as far as to say it's the type of, you know, romance novels that promise the happy ending, right? But almost, that they're a feel good type of movie for the most part, a feel good type of show. And so I think, you know, that also helped because you're putting out a relatively similar product in that regard, even if we are bending genres here and there. So I think that's something for maybe us as creators to think about, like, you know, what is it about our books that people are reading them for? But Mark, looked like you had something to say. Go for it.
Mari,
I think
you're
you're muted.
muted.
You guys couldn't hear me cussing Jeff out? Dang it.
Tragically not.
Oh, sorry. No, what Jeff was talking about with Marvel movies, I don't want to say any spoilers, particularly for anyone listening who hasn't seen Multiverse of Madness, but a lot of the critic feedback it's received is that it sacrifices some of that levity in entirely new, gosh, I'm so sorry, guys, entirely new vibe or a new tone that feels distinctly new. It feels more Sam Raimi than the traditional Marvel movement. And I think seeing people's reactions to that, it's been pretty divided. Some people are like, oh no, we love this new direction. Whereas other people are like, I was expecting a different kind of movie. And so I think there's always a level of risk, even if you're Marvel, as you try to experiment with new tones and new directions.
Yeah, a bit to that point. I think the thing that both Multiverse of Madness and Thor: Love and Thunder, which I won't get too much into either of these again for spoilers' sake, but both of those films I think are very definitively their directors' films, as opposed to MCU films. I think they very much borrow from the style of their directors first, and borrow from the style of the MCU second. Which I think hurts them commercially, just because a lot of the MCU's clout that it has gained thus far largely comes from the kind of homogeneity of the films, right? Like there is kind of the MCU standard. And so for these two to kind of depart from that, I think on some level has disappointed some of the fans of it, because it betrays kind of that core promise of this particular series. Which I think is a crying shame, because in order for the series to last, they're gonna have to do that kind of stuff going forward. I do also want to say, just briefly, back to Erica's point, I think once you have readers or consumers who have really kind of stuck onto your characters, you really can get away with murder. Both in the story, literally and metaphorically, right? I think the current kind of Star Wars experience is a good example of this. A fair number of, we really don't need to get into this.
We
It's
said
a
we
whole
wouldn't talk
topic.
about this. We said it, Mason. No,
Listen, I'm just briefly going to say, even though a fair amount of the fan base gets its rocks off talking about how much it sucks now, they still see it, right? Like they still watch this stuff. They still consume. They still participate in the fandom. And so in a sense, right, Star Wars still wins, because they became so attached to these characters, because they became so attached to this world. Now, is that what you aspire to? Hopefully not. But I think if our only goal is to keep readers reading, I think that alone shows how permissive fan bases can be with their money and time.
If everybody suddenly really got it in their brains that Disney doesn't care if you hate watch the thing, like half of online conversation would just disappear overnight. Like, oh wait, I'm actually making them money by complaining about this thing that I hate so much.
love the name change. I don't know if we want to get into those next, because we've also got, as we talk about expectation, right? That does lead to a natural segue. But if we want to dip our toes a little bit into this, we can. Does someone
No,
know?
please let this
Okay.
can of worms stay closed.
Okay.
We do
Okay.
not
Yeah,
need to
I
go
just
for
wanted
it.
to keep my name so that we knew.
I didn't
Once not
want to
recorded.
deny anyone the opportunity.
If anyone wants to comment their Star Wars opinions, they definitely can.
I just want to say I'm sorry for bringing us to the brink of the abyss. I apologize. I do think it's a good example of that particular principle. I'm sorry.
I think you do make a good point though, Mason, which is just that, once you do have that reader buy-in, there's like, like people would want to see, there's certain fans that want to see more, want to get more of what they love, regardless of what it is, to a degree, right? You're going to have some fall off, but not necessarily enough, depending on how many people love it. But anyway, in terms of the segue point that I was talking about, is the other type of series we want to talk about is that sort of changes expectations. And we were just obviously talking about that with, Thor and Multiverse of Madness, how there's this sort of Marvel expectation that then, you know, maybe isn't being carried over of that levity. Whereas something like Brandon Sanderson, I think people would be pretty shocked if they read a story of his that didn't have like a slam dunk ending that was built up in the Sanderlanche. You know, I mean, I think people would be like, excuse me, what was this? You know, so in terms of that sort of change in story, Jonah, I know you've got a theory or some thoughts on this, so please kick us off.
Yeah, so this is a little pet theory of mine that the rest of my writing group members have heard me talk about endlessly. But so the first two types that we've talked about for sequels is obviously just like the serial and then the shared world, basically. This third one isn't so much a concrete type as it is a phenomenon that most sequels can have happen to them. But it's when a sequel just kind of pulls the rug out in terms of the world building and the stakes for it in such a dramatic way that everything changes. And what I mean by this is I call this theory the beyond the wall theory, because the most famous, or not necessarily the most famous, but the ones that come to mind for me are things like James Dashner's The Maze Runner or Attack on Titan or Brandon Sanderson's recent Skyward series, where it's literally the first book or the first installment of this series is like a very compressed, compact world with very clear stakes of what happens if you go past the literal or metaphorical walls. And then later in the series, those walls are dropped away and suddenly the characters have to deal with everything that is beyond that wall. And there can be very easy pitfalls to fall into with these sorts of sequels because you are changing everything that the reader was invested up to this point. Like the beauty of stories like Skyward or Attack on Titan is that it's this engaging story about humanity fighting for its life against a greater foe. But then when you suddenly change it so that this greater foe doesn't exist anymore, and instead it's characters dealing with some other world-spanning intrigue or character motivation, are your characters strong enough that they can withstand that transition without losing everything that the readers liked about them? So I think that this can necessarily move in with the other types. I know I'm lecturing a lot, I apologize. Because with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I would say that at this point, the MCU has gone beyond the wall. Because when it first started, it was the story of a bunch of different movies of characters having nothing to do with each other who all assemble together to fight one big foe. And even in the first Avengers movie, we knew that Loki was not going to be the big bad of this entire universe. So once Infinity War happened and Thanos, the big bad Titan, got destroyed, suddenly the MCU has to deal with what now, basically. Like they have gone beyond the wall of assembling everyone together to fight one big evil villain. Are the characters strong enough that they can still be interesting and engaging? And with all these new movies and TV shows, we're really starting to see the effects of that, for better or worse.
And you really have
Divergent does this too. Divergent. The first two books take place in an enclosed dystopian city. In the third, we see what's beyond that.
Same with Hunger
back to the
Games,
MCU for a
versus
second.
the- Sorry, just want to say Hunger Games, Divergent mirroring each other. Go ahead.
Back to the MCU for just a second. That's really when you started to see a lot of the public opinion start to cool towards the MCU. Was once Infinity War was passed and new stuff started to come out, you started to get people saying, hey, this isn't the ride that I signed up for. I liked, the gradual build towards the big bad. My fear is that they're going to try and then recreate that for a second time, and I don't think it's going to work. I think they've just got to accept the fact that they dominated the market for 10 or 15 years and maybe have a slightly smaller audience that is willing to follow them to stranger places. But it is absolutely the beyond the wall problem, because they've accomplished what they set out to do, what they were promising from the get-go, from that very first film with Iron Man and the Avengers Initiative. And now where do you go from there?
This is reminding me a bit of a series I'm watching with my little brother, which I'm actually doing after this recording, called The Haunting of Hill House, which I won't spoil too much. But what they do is that's a spoiler. In an episode, it's revealed that what seems to be the big baddie isn't the big baddie. And the show is only 10 episodes. And my theory is I think they get away with it, because they do get away with it, because they lay enough foundation in those first couple of episodes so that when this twist comes, there's still a big baddie out there, and we can feel based on these hints that we've received so far that the big baddie's still out there. And so I do think it's possible to survive going beyond the wall. I think a lot of it has to do with, at least for, I don't know, over analytical audiences, which I feel like the internet really promotes at this point. It all depends on how you set up the series at first. Because if not, what you're going to get is people commenting, as they are in Thor: Love and Thunder, saying like, well, this doesn't align with what happened in the previous movie, because we like to overanalyze.
And I don't think we should give the idea that that you shouldn't go beyond the wall, right? If you want to tell serialized stories, you have to at some point. You have to reach the thing that you were going for and then find a new story to tell. You have to zoom out. You have to find, or else the story is over, right? But are the new focuses, are the new villains, are the new goals ones that are compelling enough, interesting enough to your existing readership that they're going to stick with you?
Yeah, I think getting those new focuses quickly is important. And like Mari was talking about, setting them up, at least to some degree, so it doesn't feel like I'm beyond the wall. Where am I supposed to look? What's happening? Why do I care? You're going to be like, oh, well, there's this thing over here that we can care about. And if that was even just set up a little bit, I think that can help. Because I agree. Otherwise, the story is over, which in some cases can be the right move, to be like, this story is over. And now if you've got a shared universe, now I'm going to tell this story. Or maybe you're not someone who's doing shared universes and you just have a completely different story you want to tell. That's all right too. But if you are going to write the wall and then go beyond it, I think having this in mind to get that continued reader buy-in is important. And the one last thing that I just wanted to say, at least for my end, I think so much of this is, and Jonah talked about this too, about can the characters stand on their own? For me, it's the characters continuing to be true to themselves. I definitely want to see characters change and grow, especially if we're talking about like a big series over time. But I think getting that consistency of the character is really important. For me, at least, for example, in Doctor Strange, the big changes we see from WandaVision to It in terms of like goals and decisions just seem very different. And I think that can lead some people to bounce off where they're like, oh, but wait, the character was this way. Why are they suddenly, this way? So something to keep in mind is, creating those characters that, obviously, of course, we all want compelling characters. We all want a plot that's engaging, but realizing that if your plot is changing drastically, you're going to need to rely on those characters. And in order to get continued reader buy-in, you're probably going to need some sort of consistency in that character, or at least a big reason why they might change. Otherwise, people could feel betrayed in some way, shape, or form by what you're presenting them.
I really like the fact that you mentioned Hunger Games, because honestly, in terms of illustrating this theory of going beyond the wall, Hunger Games does it in the most unique way. Because as a whole, its story structure as like a YA dystopian rebel against the institutions that are oppressing you kind of story, it's very much a serialized. Like, it's 3 books that all kind of tell the same story of a character growing to become the leader of a rebellion. But for those who, I can't imagine that most people here haven't read it, but for those who have not read it yet, just as a quick non-spoiler explanation, the first 2 books are back-to-back. Like, they are the most serialized books where they tell one thing that happens, and then at the end of the second book, they go beyond the wall, and the third book is entirely just far much more zoomed out. And the unique thing about it is that I love the third book in Hunger Games. I think Mockingjay is a very well done book with absolutely amazing character arcs and one of my favorite ending sentences, but it is not a good sequel because it falls into the problems that Going Beyond the Wall does, because the motivations and the world building that we have seen have become so different. So I love mentioning Hunger Games because of the fact that it both succeeds and fails at going beyond the wall at the same time, because it has 3 very well done books with very well done characters, but one of these things is not like the other. And it's just kind of, I can't really say that it's a cautionary tale or a success story, but it is a very unique case study of this idea.
Yeah, and I guess kind of to that point, right? Like, we've been saying, are your characters strong enough to go beyond the wall? But I think it even goes beyond that. I think in the case of the Hunger Games, the first two books are about the games, right? Like, sure, there's the intrigue and things like that, but all of that revolves around the games. And then the third one throws it right out the window, right? And along with that, throws out a lot of its characters and things like that. I think a big thing here is not just know your characters, but know your series. Know why people are reading what you're writing, right? And if they're reading for the Hunger Games, maybe don't toss that out. Or if you do, probably expect some disappointed fans, right? I think that's a big thing. It's not just like know your characters, but like know yourself as a writer, know your series, know why people come to it, because more often than not, it's not just going to be the characters. It's going to be some premise, some things like that. Stranger Things ran into the same issue, basically runs into the same issue every season when it becomes a different beast.
Yeah, and I think just to close this up, the fun thing is that, well, everything we're talking about is very successful, right? So we're talking about all these various things that are, successful. They have succeeded in some way, shape, or form. But I think, as we're saying, there's also lessons to be learned, both positively and ways we might want to change it, especially if you, as a reader, as a viewer, didn't like a particular decision someone made in the sequel. But of course, shout outs to anyone that does finish sequels, because another issue is, of course, just finishing series, which can be really hard in and of itself, right? So hopefully this has given you all some things to think about. I've definitely, just from having this conversation where you're like, oh yeah, no, the sequel I'm writing, I should be thinking about that. But hopefully this has given you all some stuff to think about with your sequels. Obviously, we would love to hear any thoughts that you have about various books and shows we've been talking about. And also, if you have anything you'd like us to discuss from Star Wars to something else, let us know. Thank you for joining us, Blackheads, and we will see you next time.